We are on the air. My name is Jim Fetty, and I'm a citizen of Wolfville, Nova Scotia. Tony Agisticoti and I have been sitting around talking about a variety of things, and he suggested that I go a little bit into my backstory, how I happened to be in Nova Scotia in the first place, because I was born in the U.S. My parents were both citizens of Portland, Oregon, and I've always considered Portland, Oregon kind of my home ground, although I was very seldom in Portland because my father was in the military. He graduated from high school back in, it would have been about 1939. He went to what was at that time called a Polytechnic High School for 4 years, where he studied to become an airplane mechanic. Back in the days when airplanes were obviously simpler devices than they are today, so you could sort of learn the trade at the high school level. And when he graduated from high school, his grandmother persuaded him to go into the military. She figured that would be a good career. They were coming out of the Depression, times were hard, and this was, I think, perceived as a kind of career opportunity, where you'd have a regular paycheck coming in. And so he signed up for what at that time was called the U.S. Air Corps. It was part of the Army, actually. It was the Army Air Corps. And he was given, I think, if I remember correctly, 3 options about where he could go on his first assignment. And his number one choice was Hawaii. And sure enough, he got his choice, and he was sent off to Hickam Field, which was the Army Air Corps base that was located fairly near Pearl Harbor, just down the road from Pearl Harbor. So he went there around would have been sometime in 1939. Meanwhile, my mother, who was at that time his girlfriend, they weren't engaged or anything like that, she thought, well, maybe she should go to Hawaii, and so she got a job there as sort of a nursing assistant in a Shriners Hospital, which was for little children. And so both of them were there on December the 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor occurred. And I can remember some years ago visiting my mother and looking through some old photographs of hers, and there was a picture of her and my father and another guy, all 3 of them looking impossibly young. And the picture in the developing process was dated as November the 30th, 1941. And I asked her about this picture, and she said, well, they had been in Hawaii for quite some time. They hadn't been able to get any time off from work to go out and do the touristy kinds of things, travel around and visit, the interesting sites in Hawaii. So they finally, on this one Sunday, November the 30th, they managed to get some time off. They've been traveling around the island, and this picture was taken of the 3 of them on that occasion. And what I found very interesting was that exactly 1 week later, the following Sunday, that was when the Japanese attack occurred. And the guy who is in the picture with my father was machine gunned to death running across the tarmac as the Japanese attack started. My father survived the attack. He had actually been on duty that night, on guard duty, and he was coming off and heading back towards the barracks to get some sleep, and that's when the Japanese attack started, very early in the morning. So he ran into the barracks, alerted the guys who were still sound asleep, got them up as quickly as he could. He himself headed back to one of the B-17s that were on the airfield. The planes were all neatly lined up all along the airfield, easy targets for the Japanese attack. They just came in and they just annihilated the planes sitting out there on the tarmac. My father, although he wasn't a pilot, he was, as I said, he was a mechanic. He actually got behind the controls of one of the planes and got it off the airfield to safety. That was one of the B-17s that actually survived the attack. And as I understand it, he wasn't somebody who talked about the war very much. A lot of guys reminisce, those were their glory days almost, the war. He never really talked very much about the war, but I discovered from him one time that he actually lived in that plane for a couple of days afterwards. It was a safe place for him to be in. Meanwhile, my mother, who was outside of Honolulu, way up in the hills, she had no idea whether my father had survived. They were still a number. They weren't married yet, but she was very concerned about whether he had died in the attack. And he, of course, knew nothing about her. He didn't know whether the hospital that she was in had been attacked by the Japanese. So neither one of them knew what had happened to the other. And it was days later that they finally communicated with each other. I forget how that happened. And they discovered that both of them were alive. So it wasn't too long after that. That was on the 7th of December that the attack occurred. So it would have been 17 days later, a little over 2 weeks. This was on Christmas Eve that the two of them got married. And because of that, my mother had to return stateside, because at that time, if you were a military dependent, you weren't allowed to be in the combat zone. If she had remained on as a nurse and unmarried, she probably could have stayed there longer, but she was sent back to Portland. And my father then continued throughout the war from 42, 43, I think on into 44. He was in the South Pacific. He was not only a mechanic, he had to have a military job, a combat job as well. So he was initially a tail gunner on a B-17. He told me one time that one of his good friends, who was just a little fellow, he wasn't much over 5 feet tall, and he was the belly gunner on the B-17. And to be a belly gunner, you had to be fairly small because it was very, very cramped quarters. But this guy was absolutely terrified to be in the in that little plastic plexiglass bubble, down underneath the plane. So he traded positions with my father. My father was a 6-footer, and he somehow managed to cram himself into the cupola there. And meanwhile, the other guy became the tail gunner. I appreciated just how cramped that job would have been, because a few years ago, when I was on a trip to Arizona, I went to an Air Force museum located in Phoenix, and they actually had a B-17 there available for people to have a look at. And I went inside it, and I just could not believe how cramped the whole plane was. But especially, the belly gunner's position was, I just couldn't imagine anybody cramming himself into something like that. So that's where my father was during the war. He had a couple of hits on Japanese Zeros. I can remember reading an article in the Oregonian newspaper. My grandparents had saved it, about his having brought down a couple of Zeros in combat. But eventually he developed malaria, which wasn't uncommon in the Pacific at that time. And he was sent to New Zealand to rehabilitate. And while he was there, he met a family. They became sort of his surrogate parents while he was there. And interestingly, years later, this would have been probably in the 1970s, probably, maybe the early 80s, he and my mother made contact with one of the girls, now a woman, that he had known in New Zealand, and her husband. So my parents took a trip to New Zealand to visit with them, traveled all over New Zealand with them. And then the next year, they came to the Pacific Northwest and then traveled around with my parents all over the U.S. So these friendships that were made during the course of my parents' travels quite often lasted for a long time. You might not see each other for long initially. You might only be together for a year or two, but sometimes the friendships lasted for decades after that. Anyway, my father must have been back in the States 9 months before March the 21st, 1944, because that's when I was born. As I understand it, once he was rehabilitated from the malaria, he was sent back to the States, where he was a gunnery instructor. So he was teaching young men on board the airplanes how to operate, the machine guns. So my parents were on the road constantly. I was born in Oklahoma, but really that was just a stopping place. I have no particular spiritual connection to Oklahoma. That's just where I happened to be, when my mother gave birth. So, before I was a year old, I had lived in Oklahoma. I lived in Mississippi, I think Jackson, Mississippi for a little while. I think I was in Florida. In fact, I think I walked for the first time when I was about a year old in Florida. We lived in, I think it was Clovis, New Mexico for a while. We were just all over the map, my parents and I. And then 2 years later, they finally made it back to Portland. And that's where my brother was born. We weren't there for very long because 2.5 years after he was born, we were down in Vallejo, California, which lay just outside San Francisco, and that's where my sister was born in 1948. So we did a lot of traveling. That was just the beginning of it. And after that, I can remember living in Moses Lake, Washington. Let me see. Well, we lived in Japan when I was about grade 5 age. We lived in Japan. After Japan, we lived in Greenville, South Carolina. Then we moved to Waco, Texas. Then we moved to Portland for a while. We would periodically go through Portland, usually not for long periods of time, maybe a few weeks or a few months on our way to someplace else. So Waco, as I said, into Portland. And then when I was right at the very, very end of grade 10, we moved to North Africa, to Tripoli, Libya. So I lived there for basically my last 2 years of high school, graduated from a place called Huilas High School in 1962, and applied for university. What I really wanted to do was to get someplace that was green, because after you've lived in Libya for 2 years, it's nice being on the Mediterranean. That's a nice feature, but you have the Sahara Desert at your back. You have what they called Ghiblis, which were horrible sandstorms that would blow up periodically. The temperature could get quite hot. And so all I wanted to do was to go to a place where it was green and where it rained a little bit. I never thought I would yearn for rain, but I yearned for rain. And so I applied to go to Lewis and Clark College, which is located in Portland. So I returned to what I considered, as I said, sort of my spiritual home, even though in my whole life, in 18 years, I don't think I had spent more than probably a year and a half to 2 years actually in Portland. And so that is where I went to university, was up in the hills above Portland in a very cloistered, a very, I would say almost a pastoral setting. The college campus had once been the estate of a Portland millionaire. It had a Tudor-style mansion on the campus, which became the administration building. It had stables for horses. It had outbuildings. It had gardens, manicured grounds. It really was an attractive campus. And it was attractive because, of course, somebody had been able to pump millions of dollars into it before it was ever used for that purpose. And then as the years went by, buildings were built on the campus in addition to what had originally been there, when it was a family estate. And so that is where I graduated from college.